time than the Swiss.
Merci Ulrike.
Thank you, Ulrike. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ulrike. Thank you, Nick. It's an excellent example of the collaboration between German, English, and French. Okay, just a quick announcement to start before leaving the team to take the floor. We have a Catholic bishop in the house, and he said that he will do the Mass tomorrow morning and Thursday morning in the Catholic chapel at 7 o'clock. Have a good afternoon.
Okay. Switch the timer going. Okay. Greetings, everyone. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you all. My name is Alan Shipman, the Executive Director of Initiatives of Change USA, and it is always great to be in Caux with the IofC family. We are speaking tonight on remaking institutions of integrity. And I remember I was up here last time, and I'm going to speak very slowly for our interpreters up there. As we gather today to discuss trust and integrity in democracy, there are many who question if democracy is worth saving. Several efforts have been made to undermine democracy, yet we do not have to be against democracy to question it. Angela Davis said, "To be revolutionary is to get to the root of the thing." Perhaps to reach the true root of our discontent and frustration with democracy at times lies deeper than just the governmental structure. In the opening session of our past forum, Healing the Wounds of the Past, last week, someone stated, "Democracy is not perfect, but it is simply a skeleton upon which to build consensus." I am here today to state that if democracy is a skeleton, for too long there has been a disease in the bone marrow. A bone marrow filled with poisonous mythologies of delusional white supremacy, exceptionalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and dehumanization. The bone marrow is the value system of the society by which it spreads into the very blood and circulation of a nation. From this disease of the bone marrow within democracy, my ancestors were enslaved. Indigenous people killed, people groups othered, and nations were colonized under a consensus built upon a poisoned value system. The good news is that just as a disease in the bone marrow can be treated with a transplant of healthy marrow, the greatest hope of preserving the skeleton of democracy is with a transplant of what Dr. King called a radical revolution of values. But our solution is not in seeing democracy as a utopia devoid of the capability of having a poisoned value system. Our solution is the courage to break the bone, see it for as it is, extract the poisonous ideologies of what Dr. King called militarism, dehumanization, and profit motives, and transplant a new value system that will circulate a new narrative and ideology devoid of the poisonous marrow that lies at the root of many of our institutions. The answer may not lie in throwing out the skeleton, but laying it bare and undergoing a surgical replacement of narrative and values. Dr. King stated, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as nations must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people and drown out the voice of the people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are almost incapable of being conquered." Dr. King is not setting before us a pessimistic future in which we have no agency to change. He is acknowledging that we cannot reshape society's systems without realizing and reshaping the values and ideologies that shape the members of society. If we fail to transplant new values into democratic systems, there will continue to be a disease in the bone marrow of democracy and systems of governance. We are not gathered here to present to the world democracy as an answer. We are here to lay the state and condition of democracy bare, to question what is the health of the narratives and ideologies that inform and shape those who form consensus in society. Many of you may be wondering, is there a doctor in the house for this surgery? Thankfully, we all have a role to play in this transplanting of values, and we will have time to both diagnose and explore innovations to create and remake a new consensus based on a shared and healing narrative. Today, we are gathered by those on the functional lines, the front lines, and future lines of instilling integrity, efficiency, and trust in institutions of governance. We will be hearing from, getting ahead of myself here. We will first hear from Dr. Plénaire, a legal scholar specializing in human rights and member of the Archbishop's Racial Justice Commission on challenges to the efficiency of democracy. We will then hear from Cambodian activist champion and interim leader of Cambodia's National Rescue Party, Rainsy Sam, as he is on the front lines of creating value-based systems of governments in Cambodia. And we also acknowledge his wife, Saumua Sam's work as the former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Cambodia as a member of parliament. We will then be joined in conversation by Michael Moeller, Danish diplomat and international civil servant who is the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, who will share the emerging world of technology and how it seeks to automate the ideological formation of society and governance. And we will also have some times together to do some exercises around examining the ways we can infuse our values into the greater society. So I will invite Dr. Plénaire to come and share with us. Let's please give her a hearty welcome.
Good evening, everyone. The moderator's words were an excellent segue into what I want to say, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate your sharp suit. So, in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus on what democracy is and suggest some reason why, we are disillusioned. But in this context, I want to talk about the relevance of IofC. So when I went to... It's not news that we are in a crisis of democracy. Half of democratic governments in the world are in decline, while authoritarian regimes are deepening their depression. I just need to keep an eye on my slides to see I'm going in the right order. So when I went to the dentist recently, I eavesdropped on his conversation with a very worried patient. He explained why her teeth will not automatically shift around and crowd together, distorting her face as she got older. Older people are not without vanity. He explained that the forces acting vertically from the forehead to the jaws and the transverse forces around the mouth and between the ears and the nose maintain an equilibrium that keeps the teeth in place. However, anything that upsets this equilibrium, such as injury or poor maintenance or trauma to the face and teeth, can produce distortions that are difficult to fix. The patient looked relieved. I was too. This explanation is actually a good description of democracy, because democracy is a paradox. It is not based on trust, but rather on distrust. A number of balancing forces create the democratic system. There is the separation of powers between those who make the law, legislature, and those who implement it, the executive, including the prime minister or president. The judiciary is independent, the rule of law is embedded, government is accountable to the people, and this is expressed through regular and periodic elections. To prevent domination of the majority, individual rights are guaranteed. These checks and balances create an equilibrium, and it prevents the abuse of power. That's the whole point. So we can trust the system. Democracy is wary of too much power in the hands of individuals, elites, organizations, institutions, or corporations. Yet, judging from the scale of past and present conflicts, our capacity to seek power to serve our own interests seems boundless. This is why the best system of government humans devised is based on a fundamental distrust of the shadowy side of our natures. When Europe was convulsed by wars at the beginning of the 20th century, which was also a crisis of European democracies, we could no longer trust nation-states to protect our rights. So after the war, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, setting out a list of fundamental rights of individuals. The drafting committee was made up of Eleanor Roosevelt as chair, Pen Chun Chang of China, and Charles Habib Malik, the ambassador of Lebanon, and a figure of considerable standing and intellectual prowess, which is why I put up only his figure, because I want to talk about him for a minute. So it might be news to many here that Malik, an Arab Christian, joined MRA when he was a student at Harvard in 1936. No doubt, MRA's ethos and principles and focus on peace building would have prepared him for this momentous task. The creation of the UN and the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a task for honest brokers, as they set about trying to repair a world destroyed by war and barbarism. Malik himself is credited with conceptualizing the basic issues in transforming the declaration. In informing the declaration. He chaired the third committee during the 1948 debates on human rights. Thus, MRA, in the person of Malik, shaped the most influential document of the modern world. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put to the vote, there were 8 abstentions. The USSR and its satellite states, Saudi Arabia, which objected, it was the only Muslim state that abstained, it objected to one article about the change of religion, and South Africa, for obvious reasons. I was born in South Africa, and it was a full 46 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I participated in 1994 in the first fully democratic election. I was also an election officer. I remember the queues, snaking around the buildings, people of every stripe standing cheerfully for hours in the hot sun, anticipating a future full of promise that we believed only a genuine democracy guaranteeing our rights would deliver. You could feel the excitement among the people, and it showed in the voter turnout, which was 86.87%. MRA helped to bring this about. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes, and in true MRA fashion, did not take the easy route. They held their largest conference in Bloemfontein in the most intransigent of places. But jump forward 25 years, and the promise of that election seems to have all but evaporated. The turnout in the more recent elections, if you look at from 2019 to 2021, general and local elections, was less than, just about under 46%. Less than 20% of the population aged between 18 and 35 registered to vote. If you turn to an old democracy like the UK, voter turnout is equally bad. It shows a similar downward trajectory. In 1992, it was 77.7%. And then by 2001, it had dipped to about 59%. The referendum, the Brexit referendum, went up again, and the last elections to 72% and 67%. But generally, it's a downward trajectory. So why this apathy and lack of participation? The fundamentals of Western democracy remain the same. The checks and balances are stable. International monitoring of human rights compliance has increased. Yet democracy is not as admired as it used to be. There is disillusionment leading to, what good is my vote? Whoever is in power, they're all equally bad. So the OECD uses these criteria to measure trust of government: reliability, responsiveness, integrity, openness, and fairness. And generally, you find the scores are not that high. Because trust is the bet we make on the future. We plan because we expect stability. The journalist Walter Lippmann first noticed how democracies were becoming lopsided during the negotiation of the peace after World War I. Public opinion was envenomed. The mood was that the Germans needed to be taught a lesson, and this influenced the politicians and statesmen negotiating that peace. And then we know what happened. The next generation of Germans rebelled, and it contributed to World War II. The relationship between the public and the governments had become seriously dysfunctional. Lippmann uses the word deranged. So it's worth asking, what does sovereignty of the people mean, which is a key pillar of democracy? Do we mean the voter, or the whole community of people, all the living, including those who do not vote, like the young, incarcerated, the old and infirm, people who died, and people still to be born? Democracies have always struggled with this. If sovereignty of the people had been taken literally, women would not have had to fight so hard for the vote. Black people in the USA and elsewhere would not have been left out of a democracy and out of the nation. There is a referendum coming in Australia this year, when voters will determine whether a marginalized 3% of the population could have an enhanced chance to be included as equals in the Australian nation. At last week's conference, Healing the Wounds of the Past, we heard from the Australian delegates what this referendum means to them. One Australian, a white Australian, her voice cracking, told me that the no vote is gaining in a campaign of misinformation and lies. And for what? To deny the original people of the country a chance to take a small step, to play their part in a democratic nation? The term the people has unfortunately been conflated with the short-term interests of the voter. As a reliable voter, and I think many of you in this room are, I am flattered, adored, and promised that my concerns are the concerns of the party that's courting me. My every whim and transient feelings are researched, and my grievances analyzed to see which party it will benefit. To be clear, I'm not arguing that voters should not represent their interests or that hard decisions do not need the consent of the people. The public certainly needs to be properly informed and the various sectors consulted. But we, the voters, are not necessarily good judges of the interests of the community at large or the nation, nor can we, the electorate, administer the state. This is the task of elected representatives. The hard business of good government sometimes means resisting the inclination of the voters. But the reverse has happened. The fluctuating feelings of the electorate are now vital to the survival of politicians. It has been pointed out that successful democratic politicians advance politically only as they placate, appease, bribe, seduce, or bamboozle. as the question is not whether a policy is good, but whether it is popular. Not whether it will work, but whether people will like it. So serious decisions need to be made about, when serious decisions need to be made about complex issues, we are told half-truths. For example, in the UK now, no politician dare publicly assess the benefits or damage, and I believe damage, done by Brexit, for fear of alienating a sector of the voters. The UK government knows we need to build more houses, but the view of the voter is, not in my backyard. This situation can displace power to the media, both traditional and informal. With AI and algorithm-manufactured opinion, the public can be manipulated and influence exerted on government by powerful and self-interested groups. Populism is the reaction to powerful elites. Since popularity is now trumping competence, statesmanship, and integrity, is it a surprise that the UK and USA were prepared to take a punt on leaders that rocked the foundations of well-established constitutional democracies? Fortunately, the institutions have held fast, but trust was eroded. So it is not enough to create a system structured to prevent the abuse of power. The human heart, undisciplined by the standards of honesty and selfishness, is furtive and will bypass structural balances, structural checks and balances. As electors, we can judge the performance and hold governments accountable for incompetence and failure to perform the duties of governments. But the system that prioritizes the short-term interests of voters will end in environmental catastrophe, too much debt, and neglect of the young, as they are unreliable voters. I want to suggest that the standards of IofC are also the virtues of the citizen, and I'm using citizen in a broad way. These standards orientate our thinking. As citizens, so we balance our own short-term interests with the interests of the whole. The example of unselfishness of IofC workers, then MRA, after the war, helped make a world of peace. And these self-same virtues must help us recover the trust between the people and those we elect, or democracy will shrivel. True democracy gives us all freedom to live without fear, oppression, and misery. And it is for this reason that the people must be sovereign. Thanks.
We will now hear from Mr. Rainsy Sam.
Bonjour, je vais parler en français.
Good evening, I'm going to be speaking to you in French. I'm going to speak to you about my own personal experience. I'm going to speak to you about what I've been doing and the situation that I've continued to live in for 30 years now. This topic of discussion about trust and integrity in democracy is something that I'm going to add 2 or 3 words to. To enforce integrity, there must be transparency. And to enforce trust, we must have dialogue. The subtitle of the reunion is to remake institutions of integrity, but before remaking them, we have to create them. And my experience about my efforts of creating the very first institution of trust, integrity, and democracy is something that I try to do in Cambodia. I've been trying to do this since 1993, so almost 30 years now. To get out of war or to get out of different regimes such as that of the Khmer Rouges. There was Pol Pot, who massacred 1/3 of the population. That was genocide, the biggest genocide since the Second World War. Cambodia was used to this regime of terror, not democracy, not dialogue. It wasn't possible for us to have any dialogue. It was a regime that commanded everybody and that ransacked its opponents and was against opponents. In 1993, the United Nations organised the first liberal elections for a democracy, for an equal democracy, and the opposition had won. I was a part of the opposition. After our victory, I was the finance minister in the very first coalition government because the former Communist Party had forced the winners to share the power with them, the people who lost. In 1997, there was a coup d'etat so that they could retake all of the power. They ransacked their rivals and opponents. So within this context, I was a part of the opposition. But I didn't want to abandon them. I created the very first party of the opposition party in Cambodia after the communism. They didn't understand. They didn't understand why I wanted to create a opposition party. There were a few opponents, yes, and they were all individuals, but we needed to create an institution. We need to institutionalise the opposition. It couldn't just be a few people, because those few people would just be killed, or they would find that they have come to the end of their term. So we needed to have a group to institutionalise this. So the current Prime Minister Hun Sen, who has been the Prime Minister since 1998, he asked me if I would like to work with him. He said that I could have lots of advantages or I would be killed. In order to be an opposant, you have to be ready to accept 3 possibilities. Either you are killed, either you are exiled, or you are sent to prison. And I know those 3 situations. I haven't actually been killed yet, because I'm still here, but there have been many assassination attempts against me. Nowadays I am actually in exile and I can't go back to Cambodia. For our world to change, they must legalise and institutionalise the possibility of having an opposition. When I talk to him about dialogue and about opposition, he doesn't understand at all. He doesn't understand how I could possibly be in a position where I would want to oppose him or his regime, and he doesn't understand what I want at all. He said to me, "You will be in charge of the minority. You would be the boss of the minority in Parliament." What they would say in English as a shadow government. Because in Cambodia they try to follow a parliamentary regime like in the UK. So he said, yes, you can be in charge of the minority. He said that I could be like him, but with a lot of advantages. But I maintained my values and my principles of transparency, of integrity. And when I talked to him about this, he didn't want to know. And he said to me, what is the opposition? I was educated in France. I was still in France when we were talking about the culture of dialogue. We wanted to create a majority that would go further than what is currently happening in Cambodia. We wanted to try and identify common points to find ideas that we would all support, which could lead us to a consensus one day. But unfortunately that did not work, because dialogue for a dictator or for somebody who absolutely wants to preserve all the power for themselves, that would not be a dialogue on equal footing. That would be a dialogue where you are constantly threatened. If I didn't accept what he wanted, or if I continued to give him propositions, he would just refuse them. But it's not always been like this. There have been high points and low points. And whilst I was the boss of the minority, we actually did manage to get more votes than he did. We actually won 50% of the seats. This surprised a lot of critics, but they didn't care. He didn't understand about dialogue. He didn't understand about democratic values. But I pursued. I didn't manage to establish dialogue, and it's been 30 years now, but I'm still continuing to try. The dictator is still there, but he will have a limit. He is more than 70 years old now. He will transfer the power to his son, a bit like in North Korea. But it's not possible. There will be a moment where people won't be happy. So the divisions within the interior, inside his party, could one day help us to have a clear dialogue one day. I hope that one day we will have this. Dialogue shouldn't just go in one way, though. We should respect the people that we are talking to. We should try to understand the people we are talking to. If we are not in agreement, it's for the people to judge within free and democratic elections. He is part of a foreign world where dictators can rule. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. As an institution committed to dialogue, it is always a powerful reminder of how dialogue weakens the dictator and strengthens democracy. We will now hear from Michael Muller. If he is on the line, here he is, ready to go. The floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the two colleagues who spoke before me. I thought maybe I'd broaden a little bit the conversation and take a a look at the framework within which what we're trying to do, which is to come up with some solutions and some suggestions on how we're going to move forward to remake these institutions of integrity and strengthen bureaucracy, strengthen the democracy, certainly not strengthen bureaucracy. I'd like to start by reminding ourselves of something which we tend to forget, which is that the last 80 years, and particularly certainly after the Second World War, but already beginning after the First, humanity gave itself an international structure that has meant that we have never had it so good as we have today. The level of peace, of rights, of well-being that we have achieved is unprecedented and happened in a very, very short period of time in historical terms. And this in spite of, I'm quite aware of the problems that we are facing today, but in spite of that, if you look at all the indicators of human activity, we are in quite an extraordinary space. Now, this multilateral system that we built and that our predecessors built is no longer really up to the task of facing these existential problems that we're faced with. It has served us extraordinarily well, but we are now in a moment where the integrated nature of the problems that we're facing, the massive impact that they're having on our lives, whether we're talking about climate or health or migration, education, every aspect of human life is such that the time has come for us to really take a very hard look at how we are going to improve on that multilateral system. And in this context, a number of things have been happening for a few years now that also influence both the way that things are happening now and the fact, the elements of lack of trust that we're talking about, and the changing points of view that we are seeing in different political fractions. And one is, we have spoken about the trust deficit, and the massive trust deficit that the world is experiencing right now is a direct consequence of some of the things that I'll be talking about. So one of the things that we have been living is a very deep governance transition. Governance at all levels of our societies, both at the international, at the national, at the local, and at the grassroots level, where the role of the state and the role of the governments is changing rapidly, where the policy setting table and the decision-making tables are no longer the sole preserve of governments, but a whole series of other actors are pressing themselves to be part of it, whether it's social, civil society in its broader sense, whether it's academia, whether it's a business community, whether it's young people, a whole series of elements in our societies that need and will be part of these conversations and these decision makings. This, of course, has brought, we are at a time, if you want, of between two chairs, and whenever you are in this kind of situation, a lot of uncertainty and problems are happening. So we have a system that doesn't work anymore properly. We are facing massive existential challenges, but we know from what I started saying, we have been there before. We have managed to come up with a system that has given us the extraordinary level of well-being that the humanity has now, asymmetrically, of course, but nevertheless, on average, something that we have never seen before. And so that spells out the fact that we know what the problems are. We understand the interconnectedness and the integrated nature of the problems. We understand the kinds of solutions that need to be applied to these problems that have to be equally integrated and collaborative. We have the money, we have the human capital. What we need a whole lot of more is some will. And I'm not just talking about political will, as we have been wont to do over the past several decades. I'm talking about a much broader will of the people, of civil society, of all of those who have something to say and something to bring to that decision-making table that will ensure that our future is a sustainable one. So in order to do that, and in order to make sure that we bring in the elements that are necessary for us to be successful in dealing with these problems, we have to look at a new kind of multilateralism and build it. It's already in the process. That is much more integrated, much more collaborative, much more de-siloed, much more networked, and much more preventive. That will help us restore the absolutely essential trust that needs to be there amongst the governed and those who govern. Otherwise, again, we are not going to make it. We have another element that has helped us over the past 10 years and so to have a global roadmap of how we are going to affect all this and in the direction which we have to move, which are the Sustainable Development Goals that are giving us, as I said, this roadmap that is integrated and interrelated elements of our human lives, and that will help us reach the goals that we're looking for. On all of this, as I've mentioned, the existential challenges that we all know about and that we're all trying to do something about. But there's one that we are only now just beginning to talk about, and which is the onslaught of new technologies that are coming at us at warp speed, and which can both be a saving element and a positive element in us in helping us to solve these problems, but can also have a very negative impact on our lives if we don't manage them properly. It's particularly important that we step out of the sort of slow lane that we're in, both in political terms, but also in terms of how we deal with these problems, and accelerate our approach, accelerate our capacity to confront these problems, and our capacity, more importantly, to adapt quickly enough to the technologies that are coming. We have to find a way of very quickly injecting the correct and the appropriate level of ethics into how these technologies are being built, disseminated, and used, a correct and useful and impactful governance structures on them, and finally also ensure that the issue of equity is taken into account. Equity in this context means that both the benefits of these sciences and these technologies are shared widely across the globe, and not just benefiting a few rich people in the north, but also to ensure that everybody on the planet, north and south, is able to participate in their development and in their dissemination. So when we look at there's one more element that I didn't mention before, which is becoming more and more clear, and that is that in today's world, and this will be increasingly true, the institutions that we have, that we're using, that are a big part of our lives, are going to be judged, and are going to be increasingly judged on the level of their impact. The time of organizations and being given the political, financial support and respect simply because they exist is over, and is increasingly going to be over. Those who don't understand that, those who lead these organizations who don't understand that, whether they're small or big, whether they're UN or not UN, whether they're national organizations, are simply going to close, in my mind, over the next decade or so. New ones will emerge, and we are also going to see, as part of that change, the integrated aspect, the sort of matrix management of our problems, where we are going to be forced into, and we'll have to figure out a way of collaboration that we have never had before. If we don't, my worry is that we simply are not going to be able to make it in time to ensure that we have a sustainable planet to live on. The bottom line that I'm looking for here is to figure out a way, in a collective way, of how to remain in charge of our future and not the opposite. And frankly, right now, the way things are, both with the massive problems in front of us, with the way technology is coming at us, with not much adult supervision, that proposition of whether we are going to remain in charge of our future or not is hanging on a nice edge, and it's not clear at all which way it's going to fall. So there is a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of collective and integrated work that needs to be done in order to make sure that we remake our institutions of integrity, but also our institutions, and help them gain the efficiency that they are needed to have in order to come up with the solutions that are going to make sure that we have a sustainable planet to live on. Thank you very much.
Can go to my slide deck for the tech team in the back. We have heard from our esteemed guest on what the challenge to transplant and infuse new values into government structures look like from their context. We will now be going into a process where you will get to hear from you and discuss with people at your table from your context on what this looks like. One of the things that to think about as initiatives of change as a value-based organization, what is the role of values in increasing trust and shaping society? One of my favorite quotes by Dr. King talks about whether we are being shaped by society or whether we are shaping society with our values, as Mr. Mola shared with us, with technology seeking to automate the values of the future and automate the society of the future. How can we, as those with moral courage and a value-driven future, seek to not just be shaped by society, but also to shape it? This quote says, "In spite of this imperative demand to live differently, we have cultivated a mass mind and have moved from the extreme of rugged individualism to the even greater extreme of rugged collectivism. We are not makers of history, we are made by history. Longfellow said, in this world, a man must either be an anvil or a hammer, meaning that he is either a molder of society or is molded by society. Who doubts that today most men are anvils and are shaped by the patterns of the majority? Or to change the figure, most people, and Christians in particular, are thermometers that record or register the temperature of majority opinion, not thermostats that transform and regulate the temperature of society." And so the question is, as we think about reshaping institutions, as we begin to think about what is the bone marrow and the skeleton of our governance structures, what are the narratives and ideologies that inform and shape those who form consensus in society? And so we're going to go through an exercise, and here you will see, this is kind of a diagram of the different pillars of pieces of society, with Dr. Pillay asking the very important question, who makes up the democracy? Is it just the person who votes? Is it just the person who engages? What is the role of community in shaping the greater society? I was speaking last week about how broken circles lead to broken societies. And many times when we think about changing systems, when systems are so violent and so grand and have been here for such a long time, sometimes we can lose our agency or lose views of how in different sectors we can actually initiate change. And so when we think about what forms the consensus, we're going to have exercises thinking about where we're going to ask two questions. For the sake of time, we're going to do both of them at the same time. When we think of religion and spirituality, and we think of the abuse of that in the rise of religious nationalist movements and how that leads into people's ideology and how that has been leading to and unfortunately supporting some of the rise in the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarian governments, we're beginning to think of how do each of these sectors play a role in eroding the trust in democracy and really how are these shaping public consensus and governance structures for the good, and then also thinking about when we look at the skill sets and where we are in our context, what are the ways in which we can innovate and use strategies to infuse our values into these systems to build a better structure. So what we're gonna do is, I'm gonna read 2 questions, and we're gonna begin to reflect on this. But as you look at this, think about what is your role in the places in which you frequent that can help influence these various sectors that lead to the type of society and the type of trust or erosion of trust that we have. So here are the 2 questions that we are going to have concerning these. What threats are emerging in these sectors of society that are shaping and eroding the trust, efficiency, and integrity of the public consensus and public institutions? And so we're going to have some time for you all to think about that. So we're going to take about 5 to 6 minutes for you all to reflect on this at your tables. And then we will have a spokesperson who would want to ask a question of people on our panel, and we will respond. So that's the first question. And the second question we want to ask is also, how can I influence these sectors to infuse new values into the public consensus and institutions of governance? Okay? Is that clear for everyone? Okay, so let's take let's take about 5 minutes to discuss at your tables. We'll leave these sectors kind of up here on the screen as a reference point. And and then we'll have a time of questions and answer for you all to share and to correspond with our panelists. So let's take 5 minutes to discuss with each other, and I'll come back and call you back into the circle. The first question, yes. 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 Okay. Okay, I'll go get some water. Not promising.
Yeah. Okay.
So everything's okay. I already cooked the champagne.
Okay.
Then just warm it in the oven.
Okay.
And just
Hang on a second.
Oh, no, he said he was going to come back. Michael on screen as well. Yes. We've got about 2 minutes left. About a 2-minute warning for everyone. A 2-minute warning. I'm going to spend some time to put the second question on as well. It's like this is not. Okay. See where Mr. Simmons. Okay. About 20 seconds left. This is essentially, it's fine to keep it here. This is the main question. It's okay to keep it here. All right, my friends. Let's come back to the circle. Let's come back to the circle because we would love to hear from you all. So we'll do some report backs first for this first question. So I got to learn that trick that Louis knows on how to whistle that I saw this morning. So everyone, if we can come back to the circle. I know it's a hard discussion to stop, but we do have dinner coming up, so we can continue the conversation there. So
Hello?
let's all come back. So for this first question that we had, around what threats are...
Hello? Hello? I think Alan is trying to get your attention. Thank you.
Oh, Sam, welcome back. It's the, I just designed questions that are too good. People don't want to stop talking. So as we are, let's hear from some groups around the first question, around what threats are emerging in these various sectors of society that you see are shaping and eroding the integrity of public consensus and institutions from your region. Let's see here.
I would like to ask questions to Samdensi and possibly his wife.
Sure.
Samdensi sounded as if he's been in opposition forever. But actually, you were in the government as a finance minister. And I remember that Cambodia did not have any customs duty on alcohol and tobacco and so on. And your revenue from timber income was not in the finance ministry, but the governors and the military. But you sorted it out in such a way that your GDP was increased. And your wife, as a deputy governor of the Bank of Cambodia, bad banks were doing a lot of money laundering. But she dealt with them in such a way that GDP revenue was increased. So in a sense, to institutionalize good values, not only in opposition, but you in the ruling party, dealt with good things for your country. So I wonder if you and your wife could tell us your experiences.
Okay.
First you.
So we'll take for the sake of time, we'll take a series of questions so we can think about that. let's go to this table, and I think I saw a hand in the back.
Which one? This one?
Right here, yes.
Well, thank you very much. We felt that your eloquence, Alan, and the rest of the people on the panel answered your question so superbly there was practically nothing for us left to discuss. Your symbol of the skeleton and the bone marrow transplant is just memorable. But we did feel that the emerging threat of AI and digital cowboyness is huge. Also, the freedom of expression in the media is being limited by the ownership of lots of media by elites and billionaires. That is not helpful. The loss of values, which sits at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there, which the IofC is definitely fighting for and needs to be upped hugely in the human consciousness, because loss of values, and your quotes from Martin Luther King remind us of how hugely we've lost his values in the last few years. And finally, the crime of aggression, which Volodymyr Zelensky put to the ICJ 2 days after the Russian invasion, remains unpunished by courts of law. And that supports Michael Muller's point that the United Nations is totally unfit for purpose and cannot anymore save us from the scourge of war. And that is an emerging threat that is terrifying.
Thank you. We'll take one more from the floor, and then we'll let our panelists respond. Was there?
Another question?
Forever hold your peace. Okay, I thought I saw it. Okay, I think Zach in the back. Okay.
At our table, we just asked the question, what is the role of gerrymandering, and which is divide and rule in elections, which is really pernicious and undermines democracy?
Okay, so those are some good questions to think about. Mr. Renzi Sam, I think in our discussion at lunch, we were talking about the different ways of authoritarianism, such as the coup that happens after the election and the coup that happens before the election. Could you share maybe that perspective as voter suppression and some of these older ways of kind of stopping democracy before the election happens is corresponding? I would love to hear your thoughts in response to that. And then could we also have Mr. Muller, if you wanted to respond to the piece on technology and perhaps the question concerning the enforcement of crimes of aggression from Dr. Pillay. So let's start with Dr. Sam. Yes.
To ensure and to promote trust, you need to promote transparency, because trust must be based on something concrete. And if you want people to believe you, you must be transparent. To answer your question, Yuki, when I was finance minister, the Cambodian state was bankrupt. There were no revenue. We had a lot of debt. So being appointed finance minister under such circumstances, it is very difficult. But I implement what I just mentioned, transparency. To increase trust is to be concrete against what you want, what you try to do to curb corruption. So as finance minister, I led teams of custom officials to go to collect the tax. Before, people who are supposed to pay tax to the state, they pay to the custom officials. It is why custom officials are very rich. But it is important to lead by example and to go to collect tax. And I tell all the custom department, I can fire you immediately, but I give you a chance. In 3 months, the state revenue must be increased to such a level. If you succeeded, you will retain your position and you will be rewarded. But if you don't succeed, you will be fired. But the objectives I fixed was very realistic, and they succeeded. And in all sectors, it was the same. Suddenly, the revenues for the state increased dramatically, and the value of our currency, the real, against the dollar increased significantly. Trust was established because everything was transparent. And leading by example is very powerful. What I mean by doing this, even though my life has been very difficult, I have been most of the time in the opposition, but at least I have shown what is possible. Even if your successes are only partial or temporary, at least it shows that success are possible. When success are possible, you increase trust. This is possible. And one day, what you nearly achieve or you achieve in a short period of time can be achieved for a longer period of time. When I led the opposition, we start from scratch. And eventually, we nearly won 50%, 45% of the vote. In spite of the intimidation, in spite of the manipulations, in spite of all the cheating, it means that we would have won if the election were honest. But this triggered a fear on the part of the ruling party. They didn't expect us to win nearly half of the vote. And we were at approximately the same level. And they decided to dissolve the opposition and not let the opposition run again in any election after that. But this, I think this may change because the pressure from the population is so strong. And what is the basis of that pressure? It is transparency. It is trust. It is the belief of what is right. You must fight for what is right, what you believe is right, even though you don't succeed completely or definitely. But every bit of success, I think, will lead to what you believe in become a reality. Thank you.
For the sake of time, let's try and also hear any questions for people who wanted to respond to the second question, which was how can IofC and our community use these same sectors that are eroding trust, infuse our values and utilize them strategically to increase justice in governance structures and in public consensus. Would anyone want to respond to that second question? I see Dai in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Daya Bhagwandas from Australia. I'm actually still processing what I took away from the workshop before tea. Yeah. And it sort of connects to what I'm hearing here. Yes. And I'm sensing that from that group that was at that workshop, there is a crying need for the training of the institutions or the people on the ground in the global south to be able to deal with what's going on with the multinationals in their parts of the world. And I can name 2 countries, but anyway, so what I'm asking is, can IofC from the global north be able to collaborate to do something for the global south to just bring them up to speed so that they can empower and engage in doing what is necessary to stop. And I'm looking at it from the business and the ethics part of it, mainly that. So it's an appeal where the international out of this forum here can work towards creating some kind of a think tank or a group, which we've done before, but I think it's time to revisit it with new energy, sensing to presencing, and then maybe realizing something that we can do together. With the wonderful experts that we have in our network between the North and the South. Thank you.
Indeed. I think I see Zach's hand.
Who's first?
Oh, I didn't know. Okay. Oh, Bill. Okay, hey. Let's go to Bill and then Zach
So
at the time.
I'm going to frame, Bill Hamilton, USA. So I'm going to frame this as a response to a question from you, and that is, how would you address the question in each of the sectors?
Yes.
This may sound too simplistic, but I would probably have a conversation, a facilitated conversation with each of the sectors and ferret out from that what is in common about their responses and what is unique about their responses, and from that develop some kind of a strategic plan for IofC to take and put in action.
Okay, thank you. Zach will probably have to be the last question before we go to closing comments.
Thank you very much. My name is Zach from Kenya, and mine is from the perspective of our continent. I would like to request the leaders who are with us here so they can help and support the work of IofC, people who are working hard to be able to promote democracy and also to enhance the skills and capacity of young leaders who are upcoming. This is to ask, because we know young people, we've had an experience like in my country, people we have worked with as young, during youth programs about peace, but the moment they get into spaces of leadership, I don't know what dose is injected in them. They change and get compromised and reverse their normal practices. So the leaders that are there and have had the experience of what IofC is doing, could we get an opportunity where we can be able to access government? Because most of government institutions, when you are a civil society, they are always thinking about criticism. But can we change the narrative and embrace IofC as one of the organizations that is going to promote transformation? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have time for one more, or we're kind of at? All right, if you all don't mind staying around. Sure. We'll do the last one and then.
It's 6:15.
It's 6:15.
16,
Okay.
by the way.
6:16. Okay.
Answer.
Okay. My point is going to the presenter that the 7 points are very huge to be answered in a very short time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then I was interested to talk to Michael Miller, which is up there with a lot of experience in the United Nations and several experience that I have seen. And also, I had a small point to Sam Rani from Cambodian. My point is that when you speak about your leader to shift the leadership to his son, and this thing is happening in Africa in several occasions. You can see a president wanted to move, and he has to make sure that he's either bringing his son or relative to the power. I don't know, is that one part of democracy? And then the other one is going to my sister in doctor, I don't know, Nirmala. You have worked in South Africa, and you have seen a lot of queue when people were doing the first election, but later on they declined. And I think the reason why they declined because there is no promise from several leaders that they have elected them, and they are not even transforming their status. Because I went to South Africa like 3 times, but I did not see the transformation that they wanted and what they were fighting for. Now, lastly to Michael Miller, There are things we see. You know, my name is Amer Manyok Deng. I'm a chairperson of Women Bloc of South Sudan from South Sudan. I'm a women rights activist. And women rights are human rights as well. We have to see some things can be changed immediately. But I don't know why does it take long. Even if a member of a state is a member, like South Sudan is a member of the UN. And the United Nations, they have a peacekeeping force in South Sudan. And several things we see they can transform and they can help us to change the situation we are in. But the situation is not changing. It's not changing in South Sudan, and it's not also changing in our neighboring country like DRC, Congo. This question I was to ask yesterday here in the other plenary, but I have to shift it to all of you. What is the issue? Because the small issue that our government is going next year to the election. And that election, there are a lot of sanctions to our country. One sanction goes to the individual sanction. The other one is about the individual sanction. There is something called embargo.
Embargo, yeah.
Embargo.
So.
Yes. And if they disarm the community, if they disarm the community, then other people can be able to come up instead of the two leaders that has been there for years, for many reasons that we might not need them because of their forces, they have guns in their hands, we cannot be able to do anything. So how can the platform of the United Nations and the entire world can help us not to continue suffering the way we are suffering? What is the challenge? Why are they not supporting women and youth so that they can do awareness to the community so that they can change the situation we are in?
So this is very important, and thank you for that question. We are, unfortunately, over time, but I think what we can certainly draw out from this, from the different leaders across the room, Dr. Pillay and Dr. Pillay have laid out a very great way for us to organize across our regions, and empowering ethical leadership is one of the strong pillars, and also impacting ethical economy is also one of the great ways in which we can collaborate. It's also pretty good that we're running right up on dinner, so if you have any other further questions, I'm sure our friends will be available to discuss further over that. But it's important that as we think about changing society, the importance and the uniqueness that our movement has is that the values, as we talk about the marrow within the systems, is what makes change sustainable. And so it's important that we engage in this work, and I look forward to also continuing this conversation in different forms and ways in which we can bring that work to the various places within our world. I would like to thank our panelists for being here with us. If you could clap for them. I'm sorry we are out of time. And a very special thank you to the interpreters who have been going. We probably gave them a master's class on interpretation due to some of our speed, but we do thank them for that. Other announcements from the team that we have to announce before we close the session? Okay, let's continue to bring this energy and conversation into dinner. Cultural evening, okay, sure. So we do have an announcement? For sure. You can come here if you'd like. This microphone is always on. It's okay. When is it?
So I believe there's a cultural evening tonight, so come along and sing and dance and listen to everyone. Voila, that's all. 8 o'clock. Here.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.